Or you get it in other situations, like even with wine and phylloxera in France. There was a point in time where over 1 million people were working in cider in France, and in France made, for a brief period of time, more cider than wine. You know, when you go back into the past, but that's very much based off that dynamic.
Are people starting to understand now, do you think, or will it take another couple of decades before we're back to reality here with cider? What do you think?
I kind of always find it like a nice reflection on human nature, actually, that when you get that version extreme, which is the complete opposite end of the spectrum to Brännland, of course, you do get those individuals who come to prominence, come out of the trees, whatever it might be, but to kind of reset that balance. Yeah. And there were those characters in cider in the UK, and you know, when I got going, this was the case, and that's not long ago. But then you have characters famed around the world for cider, like Tom Oliver and others, who it's been a passage of decades. Yeah. And a lot of them chart that back even to, and that understanding to, a fascinating woman named Jean Knoll. You know, you are talking, like Eleanor as well, you are talking a handful of people, which seems so surreal in our modern world. And yet all that has shifted in just the last 5-10 years. I do always see it as part of wider things. You know, with the likes of craft beer and natural wine, you have this counter-industrialization. You say there are massive joys, all that certain approaches to process have given us in the world. But at the same time, there's a loss of provenance of certain fascinating elements of locality. Yeah. Then you get into slightly more specific dynamics. So craft beer, for example, inherently is or can be a city drink. You know, you can get a railway arch in a city, you can make it in a place, you know, as well as anywhere else, really. Yeah. I always see that as slightly why natural wine maybe it took a little longer on the global stage to really assert its place, because inherently winemaking is a countryside pursuit. You have to be in the countryside to make it at its best. So you have a different dynamic, the journey's different. For cider, it's a country creation, but also wine at least has that prestige that then natural can get elevated by. Cider has to fight what it has become in that industrial way. But it is definitely starting to shift. It's fascinating seeing the momentum build and build.
But it's interesting because I think part of the reason that wine has retained its seasonality is that winemakers have fought to keep it that way. They are, you know, they're a powerful group of farmers in Europe, and I always wondered why cider makers didn't fight that way. But was it because it was too small and not because wine is industrialized in terms of volume and trade since 1,000 years back? But why did cider not have that fight in it, do you think?
It's a really interesting question. It's one of those questions where I think you come up with possible narratives from history, and partially the region in which cider has often found its home is more northerly and more southerly than wine. You know, if you look at it, you're talking slightly more temperate zones, the bounds that apples can grow in, compared to grapes especially. I think where Britain is concerned as well, it's a bit similar to food and drink in Britain in a wider way. There's these things that you think of as so archetypally British, even in Britain, like tea and curry and all sorts, but they are fully formed by the days of empire and the British Empire. And I think it's a really big question for Britain in general, and even currently, that history, the last few hundred years, and the way it's engaged with the world, and that's formed a lot of its identity. I think that's partially where it comes from. You know, even if you look in the history of wine, London had a fascinating role. One of the earliest places in terms of kind of binning and bottling, around that same era as the heyday of cider and perry. You'd had a mini ice age. You didn't really get much winemaking in Britain as a result. So you had this dynamic. You had the kind of rise of British Empire, but then not much wine on the doorstep. So it was being pulled in from different parts of the world, and really fueled that question of which wines, what styles, all of those factors. So I think in a way cider its history is fascinating, but it's been lost in amongst that.
That's interesting what you're saying about the mini ice age, because I've spoken to Swedish cider historians who say the same thing, that basically we were making apple wine in Sweden for a long time, and then came these years where the apple orchards actually died. And so the knowledge was lost. People stopped growing apples because you couldn't, because it was too cold. And so maybe so maybe there was no influx of product or tradition for those years, whereas wine, because it's spread over a warmer climate, still could hold its own. Maybe that's the solution.
There's all these other I think there's other examples you can look at in interesting ways. Like what's happened with cider and hard cider in the US in the last decade. Post-prohibition, that point of the quick to make alcohol, the quick to plant, quick to grow, apple trees, let alone pear trees, the number of years it can be before they crop compared to put some hops in the ground. Or you get it in other situations, like even with wine and phylloxera in France. There was a point in time where over 1 million people were working in cider in France, and in France made, for a brief period of time, more cider than wine. I think the first time I ever came across an ice cider would have been a UK maker having a little experiment. It was one of those introductions where you don't quite know the breadth of it. You don't know how much it's a one-off thing and a point. And a little bit like delving into the history with cider and all these other sort of factors, that there's so much more there than you originally thought. As soon as started to know of the Canadian approach and what goes on there, it opens into another whole world of its own. One of my favourite kind of rituals and routines that involve sweet wine, I suppose, is going with my brother to St. John, the wonderful restaurant, Chef Fergus Henderson, Trevor Gulliver, going there with my brother, and we had this ritual of having their madeleines and always dessert wine at the end. And that, for me, it's a little bit, if you go back to that, the dessert element there, it's this sort of addition on. Yes, you have to eat, you might have to drink to a degree any which way, but the extra territory, the additional, it's unnecessary, but all the better because of it, I suppose.
I mean, you're talking about it as a ritual, and I think that's relevant. I mean, because I think part of the reason that sweet wines are forgotten about is that maybe we've lost quite a lot of ritual in recent decades. I don't know if this is true, and maybe the ritual is coming back as something important to people, because sweet wine is irrational in the sense that it, again, is not as utilitarian as other beverages maybe.
There's an artistry to that as well. If inherently as well, art is not necessary in those ways, but actually it's a higher ideal because of that. And I think, again, of then various customers that we work with, the real home that ice cider finds. Again, places like the Fat Duck, there's this extra elevation. There's these other layers in what they were trying to do in a sensory way. And particularly where Brännland is concerned, knowing where it comes from, that you have the conditions to make something like this, and the existence of it is so interlinked to the nature of the place, the climate, the exquisite nature of the liquid itself that can result, has so many layers of that, and that's what people latch onto. And I always finish tastings with restaurants with a taste of ice cider. It's that little extra elevation, it's that bit of artistry that, again, in food and drink is meant to just be a wonderful part of life. You're adding more in. So
I mean, so one of the things that I've discovered in the past few years, because I'm not a classically trained musician, but I used to be a musician and write music on a very basic level, I guess. But we've been working with German winemakers for some time now as our go-to knowledge, experience. They come from a very long tradition of winemaking, and I learned from Markus Lundén, who is the winemaker at Georg Breuer in Rheingau, that what they look for in a sweet wine is a specific balance between sugar and acidity. So, the ideal is the 1 to 10 relationship between sugar and acidity. So, if you have 15 grams of acidity per liter, you want 150 grams of sugar, and that's where you're in balance. And I then stumbled upon a thesis by a British scientist, a British researcher, Ruth Tatlow, who's a classically trained musician. And she had set out to actually find out whether the myth of Bach's writing, there's always this, there's been many theories about how he used numbers and whether or not it was intentional or how mathematical it was. And she set out to uncover those myths and to find out. And she found that he wrote all his music according to a specific kind of proportionalism, which was prevalent in 18th century Germany, where the ideal from Aristotle of having a conversation with God, if you will, is that the basic idea is that you have a string, a violin string or a guitar string, and you put the saddle in the middle there. You have the same note on both sides, and the idea was that one note was the voice of God, and the other note was man trying to have a conversation with God. So turns out that Bach actually wrote all of his works, both within the works and movements, but also the relationship between these bodies of work is that he worked from a proportionalist idea, and it's what's called an unheard harmony. So it's not a tonal harmony, but his idea was that if he built his work around this principle of 1 to 1 or 1 to 2 or 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, that the music would become eternal and be played on, the day of reckoning. So, and I understood that the German winemaking ideal for sweet wine came from the same era and roughly from the same area. And so, weirdly, because I'm a fairly secular person, this idea now is interesting, and I think what I see is that the ritual of drinking sweet wine, which is irrational and meditative and not really something you can fit into a scheme of something. It's that added extra. That is something we've forgotten about because we maybe stopped consuming things purely for enjoyment, because that is not, we're in a society where you have to work a number of hours every day, and there's less space for irrationality in our lives, and sometimes I think that's why sweet wines are sort of, have gone to the side a little bit, because it is a ritual and it's irrational, and you can't really defend drinking sweet wine with anything else but enjoyment, and you have to have time to enjoy it. So the change we're seeing now in terms of sales, I think, maybe reflects a change in consumer attitude towards wine. It is becoming more experience-based, which I think is a fine thing. And, that sort of also speaks for craft cider and craft beer and natural wine to come to the fore, because people are now looking for experiences. So all, in wine you can see grape varieties that haven't been used for many years, that have been considered inferior to the big five of noble grapes. And winemakers who find out that, the fact that they're not used anymore is not about the big five being so great. It's actually about other more practical matters. And so I don't know. And I think ice cider is interesting because it sort of, it leapfrogs the whole history of sweet wines, and yet it is a sweet wine. And so maybe, yes, that's what we're seeing, that people that don't like, people say, I don't like sweet wines, they're too cloying, they're too sweet. And they try ice cider, and of course it has this fresh acidity, which is also very specific to this landscape and to the apples that we have here. And they go, okay, but this is good, this is fresh. So the ritual of drinking sweet wine, I think, is is part of why it hasn't been accounted for a long time in a more modern society.
It's a fascinating way of always thinking about drinking. I don't know if you've ever read the hilariously named "I Drink Therefore I Am" by Roger Scruton. So you said the way of thinking, but my background actually before all of this, I studied art, and I always think there's a lot of similar things in play. I think that's partly why I got involved with cider, because if in some ways you can say one of the main things going on with the creation of art is a sense of value judgment, particularly highlighting the extraordinary and the more everyday, how you live well in many ways, what you value. That was partly what appealed to me, I think, saying there's something incredibly valuable in cider, in the possibilities and the potential that then you discover was proven and known in the past and has, in so many regards in the mass market just faded from what anyone associates with the word. And it does bring in a real sense of place. It's a little bit like the joy of seasonality. I think it's increasingly important to people again, but it's a grounded structure, particularly in the digital kind of world. And in Britain, you have this real big return of wassailing, the old 12th night kind of blessing of the orchard with flaming torches and shotguns.
Okay.
And it happens quite a lot, not at times even in relative isolation from, it's not purely the small cider community. I think particularly with things like Brexit going on and such like, that sense of tradition, of locality is all the more appealing. And I had a beautiful little visit to the British Library a bit before Christmas. They had this amazing exhibition of, one of the oldest books in Europe, all these amazing old manuscripts. My favourite was this section of the scores from different musicians. And it was amazing how, some of them were the dressed up finished version, not the rough draft, but how even visually it was a reflection on then the music that There was Chopin, Debussy, just the character that it had. And it might just be me reading that into it. But I think those factors are glorious, yeah.
But that's the case with any art, I guess. It's
the eye of the beholder.
You do read into it, but it also is there because you see it.
But that's a valuable part of it, isn't it? That's actually a joy. That's to be celebrated. Yeah.
But that's interesting what you're saying about ritual, and that some of these things are coming back. And I don't know. I have a hard time. It just makes you very pretentious to talk about having a conversation with God, whatever that might be, or he, she, it. But there is something to be said for trying to reach for something higher, I guess. So becoming a cider maker, and then as we do now, identifying as winemakers rather than cider makers. We just happen to use a different raw material, and that's not because we don't want to. That's not because we're ashamed of making cider. It's just an approach to it, and we take all of our knowledge and experience from the winemaking world, because that's where the knowledge is, and that's where it stayed, like we discussed earlier. Like, there's this gap in the cider industry and in the cider making traditions that's just like a black hole in the last decades, whereas wine has kept the continuity of a very long line backwards. Yeah, and making sweet wine is also difficult, so it does have to become an art, because you really have to think about it on your feet. You can't. It's constant improvisation. Yeah. There's all this debate about whether certain factors of winemaking are super influential in the wine or not. Like, we're talking about yeast or sulfur or the way it's made or what we add and what we don't add. But when you actually produce wine, there's 1,000 decisions all the time, and we tend to, if you look at winemaking from the outside, it becomes this programmatic thing. We put it in boxes, you ferment it, But in reality, it's a moving target all the time, and what makes a wine is not one single decision on its own, but it's all the decisions that you have to make. So, in that sense, I think maybe also that's why I got drawn by it, because there's this cliche that wine is the place. It's one of the few places where art and craft meet, you know. And it's going to be very interesting to see in the coming years as a new generation of cider makers come up that are not constrained by the idea of what cider was as an industrial thing, and that maybe come from other areas like winemaking. Like they're really gonna change the map.